Hi everybody, welcome to the Parallel Systems broadcast. I'm your host Mike and thank you for tuning in to this very special episode. This was an episode that was voted for from my YouTube channel members. So a big shout out to Hoshin, Kathy Q, Anders Madsen, Freedom and BH for choosing this episode. This was the episode that they most wanted to see and it's all about gold confiscation. Now, I'm really excited to share this episode with you and I'm doing it as a live stream so you'll be able to chat with me as I go through. And what we're going to be talking about today is the prospect of a gold confiscation in the future. And to discuss this, I'm going to talk about some past instances of gold confiscation. Why did it happen? And then we're going to talk about the future. What's the likelihood that it will happen again? Also, as we get to the end of the show, I'm going to be discussing a gold confiscation in light of what we have learned about the BRICS plus monetary system and how they're going to be using gold to back the new global reserve. What does it mean in terms of gold cryptos that Russia and Iran are talking about? And I don't think I've heard anybody else speak about gold confiscation in light of that. So that's going to be something new. So hopefully you'll take something away from this. You'll find it interesting and it will help you to protect your wealth. So to begin with, let's just talk a little bit about gold confiscations. What do I mean when I say a gold confiscation? Well, there's many different types. And like I said, it's happened many times throughout history. Probably the most famous gold confiscation in history was the one that happened in the US. Most people know this as Executive Order 6102. And this was April the 5th, 1933, when US President Franklin D. Roosevelt issued Executive Order 6102. And in this order, he essentially nationalized the gold holdings of the country that were held in private citizens' hands. And the way that he did this was he released this order, and in the order, he forbade the hoarding of gold coins, gold bullion, and gold certificates within America. Now, what does that mean? Well, basically, the insinuation was that because of the economic crisis the US was going through at the time, of course, they were just going through the Great Depression, they were having a banking collapse, the country was sliding into financial ruin. Because they was retaining the gold, remember, all dollar notes had to be backed by gold at the time. I think it was 40% backing. So because they were hoarding the gold, this meant that it was dragging down the economy. Remember, there was in a great deflation at the time. So he issued this order to try and pull out all of this gold and give it back to the state. Now, at the time, gold was valued at $20.67 per ounce. And the plan was, by the US, was to take back all of the gold of the citizens, then revalue gold, thereby devaluing the dollar to get themselves out of financial crisis. Remember, this wasn't to help the citizens, it was to help themselves. And that's exactly what happened. So they issued Order 6102. Now, interestingly, this order was issued under the Trading with the Enemy Act from 1917. Now, this was an act that was brought in for something entirely different. It was brought in during World War I, and it was to stop anyone in the country, it could be a citizen, it could be a company or a corporation, from trading with the enemy. So this was any country that the US considered an enemy, and of course that was a part of World War I. However, the important part of this was it was never repealed. So when FDR wanted to do this order and confiscate the gold of citizens, he basically found an old law that he could do it under. Now, it wasn't an out-and-out confiscation because the government didn't say we're taking it and you're getting nothing in return. What the government said was you have to hand over your gold and we will give you the official market rate, which, like I said, was $20.67 per ounce. And lots of citizens did this. So, like I said, it wasn't an out-and-out confiscation. It wasn't people with guns. However, there was a legal consequence for not doing this. It was a $10,000 fine and up to 10 years in prison or both. So it was definitely done under threat. If you didn't abide by it, you could be sent to prison. And remember, $10,000 fine back in 1933-34 would have been like a 200 grand fine today. It was massive. So the threat was huge. They were very deadly serious about getting that gold back. However, it wasn't like you had to give all of your gold. There was 5 coins that you could keep. So basically about $100 worth of gold you could keep. Which, again, like I said, it was still a confiscation, but there were some exemptions. Similarly, if you worked in jewelry trade, or if they were actually coins of historic value, so numismatic coins, they could be exempt. So there were some exemptions, there were some ways to get around it. But in general, most people complied and had to give over their gold coins. Now, don't forget, gold was actually money at the time. It wasn't like people was giving away their investment gold. This was actually money that was circulating. But remember, there was paper dollars too. And as often happens, when people fear that the government is debasing the currency, they start to keep what's of real value and use what is not of real value, which is the paper. And that's why they needed to pull the gold back out. And this confiscation, I'm calling it a confiscation, you could say it was a nationalization, but this confiscation was very successful, and they used that to actually fund the creation of the Exchange Stabilization Fund, which is a big slush fund that still exists today that the US can use to, well, pretty much do what they want. They use it to manipulate the price of the dollar, to attack other currencies. They use it for all kinds of things. So like I said, that was probably the most well-known incidents historically of a gold confiscation, but there was many more. There was many more too. During World War II, for example, there was out and out confiscations. This was when the Nazis not only confiscated gold of other countries, so like when they went to the Czech Republic, they sent an order through to the BIS and the Bank of England and said, that gold that you're holding for the Czechs, it's ours now. And of course they complied because they were all banksters and they didn't care about the potential for war with Germany. They cared about skimming some cream off the top, so they gave the Nazis the money. Now the Nazis also confiscated gold from citizens, so they went around with guns and they took whatever gold they could get. Of course, we all know the stories of them taking gold from the Jews, the Poles, the Gypsies. When they rounded them up and sent them off to concentration camps, they would take anything. Gold wedding rings, golden teeth, didn't matter. They'd take it all. So again, that was an out-and-out confiscation and one of the most brutal types of confiscation because it is done at the barrel of a gun. But again, that is rare historically. That's very rare historically. It's very hard to enact such a thing. That really only happens during the most severe of times, like I said, like a war. Now, other countries have confiscated gold too. The UK did it, Australia did it. When it came to the UK, theirs was quite interesting. Again, this was done when gold was not monetized. So this was a different type to the US, and it's an interesting one because like I said, when the US did it, there was actually some rationale there for why they did it. You could understand it. Not saying it was right, but you could understand why they did it. But when the British did it, gold was not actually a part of the monetary system. So there's a precedent there that gold has been confiscated when it wasn't actually being used as money. Now, the British confiscated the gold of their citizens in 1966, and again, it was under the threat of a fine and being put in prison, and they had to turn over their gold and get, again, the official market rate. And like I said, this happened in 1966, and then in 1967, they devalued the pound and revalued gold. So it's important to recognize this pattern. Prior to a revaluation of gold, they confiscate the citizens' gold. And in the UK, I think you was allowed to keep 4 coins maximum, so even less than in the US, despite it being many years later. Now, as I said, there was other situations throughout history. There was voluntary confiscation too that happened in Italy when Mussolini asked the public to hand over all of their gold for the motherland so that they could use it to enact war. And lots of people handed over their wedding rings. That was a famous incident. There would be someone in the center of town with a bucket, and all the ladies and men would come, and I think it was just women that had wedding rings back then, and they would put their golden wedding ring into the bucket, and they would be given a special iron wedding ring that had some engraving saying something like protectors of the motherland or something silly like this. And lots of people did this. Not just in Italy, but Italian nationals in other countries. So nationalistic were they and proud of their country that they were willing to do this. Of course, many years later, they'd look back with deep regret that they gave away their wedding rings to be melted down and used for war, but that's what happened. So that's what confiscations can look like. It can be a forced confiscation at the barrel of a gun. It can be the government nationalising the gold that's within the country and saying we'll give you the going market rate, or it can be a voluntary thing where people do it out of some kind of allegiance to the state. Now, today, to confiscate the wealth of a nation is much easier because gold is not a part of the monetary system. And the way they confiscate our wealth today, as we all know, is through currency debasement. They just print the notes. And that's what's been going on since the 1930s, since gold was in the monetary system. Of course, there was the Bretton Woods system, but they were debasing the currency then. And once we went off the Bretton Woods, this went into hyperbolic mode where they just printed and printed and printed. They had nothing to stop them, no limiters. And that's what's got us to the situation where we are today, where we have hyperbolic government debt all across the world. So right now, there is no immediate risk of a gold confiscation because it simply doesn't matter. If they want to confiscate your wealth, well, they're already doing it. They've been doing it for a long, long time. However, things are changing. Things are changing very, very rapidly right now. And as you know, if you've been watching this channel, their plan is to put gold back into the monetary system. This is what the BRICS are currently planning for. China has been hoarding gold. I'm going to use that word because it's an important one. It's actually a legal definition, hoarding. If you look at it in the legal dictionary, hoarding is a term that's used when it comes to somebody supposedly keeping too much of an asset. So hoarding it and having more than they need. That's what it means. And that's an important one. I'm going to come back to why. But China certainly have been hoarding gold, and by all estimates, they now have around 30,000 tons, maybe 40,000 tons. Nobody knows. All of the gold that goes into China stays in China. And Russia's been doing the same, and they've been mining all of the gold in their own countries and again hoarding all of that. So what were they doing it for? Well, we know why. They've been setting up for a new monetary system because, like I just said about the current system, it is now swimming in debt. We've got hundreds and hundreds of trillions in global debt, and we've got derivatives in the quadrillions, and they're so opaque, nobody knows where they lie. And they're all threatening to come down. In fact, they've come down a few times already. They've managed to bail the system out numerous times, but we are now in the final stages. And everyone sees that, everyone watching this channel at least. So China and Russia have been setting up for the new global monetary system. And they're going to start to back their currency, or at least the global reserve currency that they're planning to create. And again, right now we've got the global reserve as the dollar. They're creating a separate one. And that's going to be gold. It's going to be a gold-backed SDR, essentially. I've spoken about this many times on the channel. They're using commodities also to begin with, so it's going to be gold and commodities. But ultimately, this is going to end up as a gold-backed system, and that's completely changing the game. It's completely changing the game for everybody. And where's this going to take us? Well, I can tell you where it's going to take us. Very quickly, it's going to take us to a situation where the Western nations, it's going to force them to going back to a gold-backed system too. And it's very easy to understand why that is, because if you imagine the system right now, people have to use the fiat currencies of the West. They have no choice. Other nations have to use the dollar. They need to use it to buy things like commodities. However, once this new system's up and running, or even before it's up and running, they are now starting to take themselves out of the dollar. They're getting rid of their dollar reserves and replacing it mostly with gold. They're also using national fiat currencies. However, once we get to this global financial crisis, we're going to be in this really crazy time where all of the currencies are essentially untrusted. No one's going to trust those currencies because there's nothing to back them. So they're going to have to go back to using what? Well, of course, it's going to be gold. And we're already seeing that, right? We're seeing that with Russia right now. Russia are doing trades for oil and commodities and gas. They're using gold and they're accepting gold, and they're coming up with all kinds of solutions like a gold-backed cryptocurrency, for example. That's one of them. And that's something that we need to discuss later on today too. And so all of the countries are going to be forced to use gold and put up something of value because they're not going to trust the system. And the closer this system gets to collapsing, then the more we're going to have to depend on gold, or the more nations are going to have to depend on gold. So we're in this transition period. We're in the transition period now. And the fiat collapse is coming. We don't know exactly when that's going to happen. But as the global economy begins to melt down, we're in a slowdown now, but as that begins to melt down, the financial system will start to follow. So, in the coming year or so, if this global economy comes to a grinding halt, well, that's it. That's it. It's going to start to bring down the financial system. Yes, they could print more money, but we know what happens then we go to hyperinflation. That's what's happened many times throughout history. We get to the point where the currency is just hyperinflate. And that's the last point. That's the end game. They can have a deflationary bust or they can have a hyperinflationary bust. And they're going to go for the hyperinflation because why not add one extra step? They're trying to buy themselves as much time as possible. So as everything slows down, it's going to bring down the financial system one way or another. And then we're going to enter the phase where there's just an international currency crisis. This interchangeability of currencies is going to stop. Nobody is going to trust a fiat currency. No country is going to accept another country's fiat currency as settlement for debts, international debts or goods. It's just simply not going to happen. There's going to be no trust in the system. And at that point, the nationally held gold of different countries is going to start to be placed between nations to settle trade and cover debts. They're going to actually have to use their nationally held gold in international trade again. So it's exactly what China and Russia were trying to box the West into doing. Their plan will succeed at that point. And they basically just looked further out from 2008. They saw, right, okay, we can see now there's going to be a meltdown of the current system. They bailed out the system in 2008, but they saw that in 5 to 10 years, it's actually gone on even longer than that, that eventually we would have this reckoning. So they knew, they had the foresight to say, right, if we get gold now, if we just stock up on it, then when that meltdown happens, the West is going to be screwed and we're going to be catapulted into the top positions. And that's what's going to happen. As long as you've got military and you're willing to fight for the position, then you can do that. That's what China's intending to do. So no matter what, gold will be mobilized. It's going to have to be mobilized by all the countries of the West. If you want to buy commodities from another nation and you offer them some yen or pound or dollar and it's hyperinflating, they're going to say no. They're going to say no. And if you want to survive, if you want your government to survive, you're going to have to provide something for your people. How are you going to buy food if you import most of it? How are you going to buy oil? You're going to have to put up something of value. Now, most of the Western nations don't really have much of value. But what they do have, of course, is their national gold holdings. And now you can see where I'm getting with this. Because gold's going to all of a sudden become absolutely fundamental to the global monetary system. By default, it's going to happen. So could they confiscate gold from the citizens as well? Well, that's where we're going to get to, because gold's going to be so important for international liquidity. Now, it's quite likely at that point the governments in gold-strapped countries will seek to make gold the sole authority of the state. Because if you think about it, if they want to use their gold, or as I think will happen, revalue their gold holdings, it would make sense at that point that they actually want to revalue it, because it's going to become so important that all of these years where they've been repressing the price down for obvious reasons, they didn't want people to put their faith in gold. They wanted people to put their faith in fiat. But all of a sudden, they're going to need to use and mobilize that gold, and they're going to want to get rid of as little gold as possible. So at that point, they're going to try and revalue it, in my opinion. And if they want to do that, then it's especially true that they're going to have to make gold the sole authority of the state. And what do I mean by that? Well, I mean they're going to have to shut down the free market of commercial gold sales, because that would act against national interests, wouldn't it? Much like right now, the free market in oil acts against the national interests of the West when it comes to putting a price cap on Russia's oil. Right now, we've got the West saying we're only going to buy Russian oil for this price. And what does it do? Nothing. It can't do anything because there's a free market in oil. You can't revalue somebody else's oil when there's a free market. You simply can't do it. Because if you do, people will say, okay, well, I'm not going to sell it to you for that price. So what are you going to do? And we can't do nothing. So it doesn't work. Now, the same thing would happen if they wanted to revalue gold. They couldn't have the free market dictating the price of gold, because it might go too high, it might go too low. They don't know what it's going to do. So I think they would clamp down on it at that point, and they'd want to come to some kind of international agreement as to what the new price of gold is. Now, this may be done separately from the East. They could put up a Cold War type wall, like a Berlin Wall, right through Europe, and literally lock everyone out from seeing what the other side is doing. That might happen. We don't know, because we don't know what's going to happen with the war. How far is it going to go? How far are they going to take it, should I say? So there is the potential that it happens in two separate blocks, and literally they cut off all trade from those two blocks, similar to George Orwell's 1984. But whichever way they do it, whether they do it separately or come together internationally, they will revalue gold, in my opinion, and they will do that in their own national interest, and they'll have to cut out the free market. Now, that's in the interest of the West for sure. Now, would it be in the interest of the East to revalue gold? Well, of course. This is the checkmate that the Chinese have got the US in, because the Chinese have massive gold holdings. So if the West is forced to revalue their gold, it works to the favor of China and Russia and India, who also have big gold holdings. So they've really got them in what I call the golden checkmate now. No matter what the West does, it's kind of screwed. You know, they're going to be on the hook for this big collapse of the fiat Ponzi scheme. And they're going to go into the dark ages, essentially. And all they're going to have is their gold. If they revalue it, that only favors their enemies. And you can see where we get to. So at that point, at that point, once they get to this stage where they are forced to mobilize their gold, I think large pools of gold at that point, especially in these indebted nations, are going to be extremely vulnerable. They could start to nationalize gold, they could start to confiscate gold, and the gold they're going to go for is pooled gold, ETFs, digital gold bullion, vaulted gold as well. Vaulted gold bought through companies like Glyn or Bullion Vault, they may well have their assets nationalized too. So anything that's bought through those companies could be nationalized as well. It could be nationalized by the country where the vaults are. So if you've got vaulted gold, say in London, and the UK says we're nationalizing the gold, they could nationalize the gold in the vault. They could do that. It could be seized by the country of the citizens who invested in that gold. So let's imagine you're based in America and you have gold vaulted in the UK. Well, America could say we're seizing that gold and force the UK to send it back. That could happen. There's all kinds of things that will happen if they want to start confiscating the gold. And anything that's pooled in an ETF, like I said, a vault, that stuff is the fair stuff to go. That's going to be the fair stuff. It's going to be very, very easy to get the hands on that. And that's really what it's about. It's about ease of access by the state. The easier it is for them to access, the lowest hanging fruit, that's what they'll go for. And that's why we always say, if you've got your money in these things, there's so many counterparties. In the coming decade, it's going to be at risk, high risk, because of everything that I've already spoke about. We are entering a completely different paradigm. Again, safety deposit boxes. How safe are safety deposit boxes? Well, in the US just recently, we found out that they are similarly vulnerable. The FBI raided over 800 safety deposit boxes in Beverly Hills, and they had no legal grounds for doing so. And they went through all of these boxes. They confiscated cash, bullion, wedding rings. They took the lot. They were taking photographs of all of the pieces of paper, the documents in there, prenuptial agreements, password lists. They took photographs of all of that, contracts, all kinds of stuff. And they had no legal grounds for doing this. They simply said that there was allegations of criminal wrongdoing. They didn't give a name, they didn't give a specific, they just said there was allegations, so we had the right to go in those safety deposit boxes, take what we wanted, photograph what we wanted. Now, who knows what they were really looking for? It could be something to do with the deep state. Maybe someone had some information that they wanted to find, and they had a tip-off that it was in a deposit box. Who knows? But the simple fact is, they went and they looked for all those boxes. They were not safe at all. Now, there has been a lawsuit put against the US government for doing this, and I think that one was rejected by the court. So again, if you've got your money in a safety deposit box, what are the chances of it staying safe if there's a confiscation? Very little. They can do what they want. They can do what they want when it comes to that. So what about taking bullion that you own physically? Well, that's a very different story. That's a different story because it's extremely difficult for them to confiscate that. Like I said, short of a war and an out-and-out civil war, where you've got people going round and raiding houses and lining people up. And if that's happening, you've got much bigger problems, trust me. So I don't think that's the risk. I don't think that's going to happen. I think if there is going to be a confiscation in the future because of these things that I've spoke about, because of the need for the West to have increased amounts of gold in comparison to countries like China and Russia and India who have been preparing. Remember, those countries have very little debt. I'm talking Russia, I think they've got something like debt to GDP. I think it's something like 10 to 12% or something ridiculous. You know, and a lot of the Eastern European nations too. So really that's not the problem. They're not the problem. You know, they're probably going to survive. But these countries like the UK, Great Britain, the US, Australia, Canada, those countries are extremely vulnerable. So it's very different as well if you're looking at the East versus the West when it comes to confiscation. If you're in China, could they confiscate? Well, of course they could. They're authoritarian. But are they going to? Probably not. China's been encouraging that their citizens buy gold ever since I think it was the mid-2000s when they started to actually advertise on TV. And the Chinese all of a sudden started to buy gold hand over fist too. So their citizens have massive gold holdings. So China's been preparing for this really, really well. It's not just their own gold holdings, it's the citizens too. India as well. India has something like 60,000 tons in private hands, in the citizens' hands. And of course, then they've got the gold that the state owns. So again, they've got an awful lot. Russia's the same. Their citizens have been encouraged to buy gold, to invest in gold. So they're all preparing. But in the West, I think that's the vulnerable place. Like I said, if you're in an indebted nation, If you're seeing your democracy fall apart all around you, that's a big one too. If you don't have a strong democracy anymore, remember all these countries we used to say they're strong democracies, it would never happen here. Well, I've got news for you. Last year and the year before, they were stopping people from sitting on park benches. They were police taping off children's playgrounds. They were stopping people going to work and closing down businesses. They wouldn't even let people go for a walk on the beach in Australia without getting 6 coppers jump on them and truncheon them to pieces. So democracy is fading fast. It's fading fast. And as such, you have to take the threat of any kind of overreach by the state very seriously, very, very seriously. But like I said, I don't think they're going to be coming to people's houses and saying, do you own gold? They simply would not know. They simply would not know. And even if they did, it's extremely unlikely they're going to do that. So, really the ultimate prize here is bullion, pure uncompromised bullion. If it's outside of your control, in any of those different ways, and I know there's a lot of people who like to use things like Kinesis and Bullion Vault too, but you've got to be realistic. If we're talking about this future and the collapse of the fiat monetary system, the threat really is there that could all be taken. So, let me find where I am. Yeah, so commodity producing nations, they're probably going to be okay. I don't think they're going to be looking to take the citizens' gold because they have commodities and the new monetary system is full of commodities. You can back the currency by commodities and they can easily transfer or trade, should I say, their commodities for gold. The resource poor countries of the West, their citizens, well, yeah, that's going to be difficult. There is the potential that they say this is an issue of national security. Remember, the original confiscation in America was the Trading with the Enemies Act. The Trading with the Enemies Act was what they used to take back the gold. Now, it's interesting because in the coming potential confiscation, they could resurrect that and say it's an issue of national security. You must hand over your gold because if not, China's going to win. Russia's going to win. They could say that. Now, that might have sounded a bit absurd a few years ago, but now everyone's starting to see what's happening with gold, how it's being put back into the monetary system. It really actually is an issue of national, I won't say security, but supremacy. It's an issue of national supremacy for the US. And we've already seen the lengths the US is willing to go to try and stop this new global order from coming together. They've gone to war. They're willing to sacrifice Europe and Europe's energy, Europe's population. And make no mistake, the other countries on the opposite side are thinking the same. But in the West, that could mean the US says, right, well, we want you to hand over your gold. Now, what would that look like? What would it look like? Like I said, I don't think it would be someone coming to your door to take it. So what could it look like? Well, it could involve what it did originally in the 1933 confiscation. They could say, right, well, we want you to sell it to us at a set price. Now, I think if they did this kind of forced sale, that would happen before the revaluation, similar to as before. So if they're going to revalue gold, as I think they're going to, and just as an aside on that, we talked about a revaluation in a recent video, and I saw a chart just recently that the inflation adjusted price of gold, if we look at its previous all-time high, inflation adjusted, that was back in the 1980s when it reached around $850. Inflation adjusted today, that would be around $50,000 per ounce. $50,000 per ounce. Now, when I made my prediction in my previous video, I said in today's money, my prediction was a minimum of $25,000 per ounce revalued. And some people may have thought that sounded like a lot, but if you look at the inflation adjusted all-time high, it's actually quite pedestrian. It's 50% less than that would be. So make no mistake, we could see a huge revaluation in gold as it becomes intrinsic to the monetary system again. But like I said, to do that, I think they're going to want to get a stranglehold on gold itself. And all of a sudden, this thing that they called a dumb pet rock, well, people are going to see the truth at that point. People are going to see the truth. Now, are they going to want citizens running out and buying gold because it's going to be revalued? Of course they're not. Quite the opposite. So they could come for the gold at that point and they could say, you have to sell your gold to us at a set price. And it would be the price before the revaluation. So they may say you have to sell it to us, let's say, for example, at $2,500. And then they collect all the gold, they threaten people with prison. And then after they've got the gold, they revalue it to $50,000 per ounce. That's what could happen. So again, is that a confiscation? Well, It is, but it's voluntary too. People would have to take the gold to them, tell them that they've got gold, if they do, and then sell it to them, knowing full well what's likely to happen next. So that's one way they could do it. It could be forced sale at an official price. How else could they do it? Well, they could add a huge windfall tax to gold. So that's another thing they could do. They could revalue the gold, but then say if you sell the gold, you are going to be taxed on the profits 90%. A windfall tax. Now, this has a precedent in history. They have applied windfall taxes many times before. In fact, we're seeing it applied now to different industries, such as the oil and gas industry. They're applying windfall taxes to the corporations for their profits in recent years. Could they do that to a citizen? Of course they could. So that could happen as well. But without a civil war or some kind of real crazy social conflict, I don't think we'll see an out-and-out confiscation. So that puts the power in your hands. And even if they did, how do they know who's got gold? There are ways for them to find out if you've bought it in certain manners and things, which I'm not going to talk about here. However, I am going to be writing a special article for my patrons, which is 5 ways to protect yourself. 5 ways to protect yourself from gold confiscation. So I'm going to be putting that up on my Patreon for all my patrons to read. Even if you sign up to the lowest tier of that, you'll be able to read that. And that's going to be more specific. That's going to be some very specific advice. But I'm not going to give that here on YouTube. But like I said, really, it's going to be optional. It's going to be up to the people if they decide that they want to hand over their gold for some crappy price and give up all of their wealth, because that's what's going to happen. If you give up your gold, you will be wiped out financially, the same as everyone else. And they may be seeking to do that for all the reasons I always talk about. They want to trap you in a CBDC. They want to get you going down with the ship. They're essentially asking you to give up your life jacket on the Titanic, and not to give it up to a child to save somebody else. They're asking you to give it up so that somebody else can wear 5 life jackets. Somebody with a lot more power and money and wealth than you. So it's a philosophical question. It's a moral question. Is it moral to follow an unjust law? Did you create the Ponzi scheme? Is it your fault? Have you been debasing the currency? Have you been a bankster all of your life and raping the system and taking what you can for yourself and exploiting everyone else? No, of course you haven't. What you've done is the right thing. You've paid your taxes, you've worked hard, probably, maybe not everyone, but most people. And you had the intelligence and foresight to see what was coming. You had the knowledge, you took the advice of other people, you read, and you figured it out. And then you took action. So should you be put on the hook for that corrupt beast system that we're talking about? Of course you shouldn't. So it's a moral question. And, you know, when it comes to laws, like the way that I see it is a law is meaningless unless it has the moral backing of the people. Unless the people feel that that law is moral and actually follow it, then it's not going to work. It's not a law. So another thing as well, like, you know, we're talking about this global parasitic class. Do you think that the laws would be attached to them too, that they would abide by them? Of course they wouldn't. It would only be the little people. It'd only be the regular Joe and Jane, us guys, that had this thing put upon us. They would still have their palaces. They'd have trillions in wealth, land, gold, art. It's the people that they're trying to take things of real value off to trap them for the next system. So that's another thing to think about. Law is actually fundamentally about justice. Now, would that be justice if they came and took your only protection? I don't think it would. So I think you need to think very carefully about things like that. And another thing as well that I'd consider in those scenarios, if you was given the option to give up and allow your gold to be confiscated, the other thing that I'd consider is if you think about where we are today, we've had thousands of years of this Ponzi scheme system of usury, of these same people retaining the power, destroying the wealth of the populaces. And it just goes round and round again. All of a sudden, we've got to this point now where we have that system collapsing. We have that system collapsing and they are terrified. Make no mistake, they may appear confident, but it's like Sun Tzu's The Art of War. Appear confident when you are weak and appear weak when you are confident or strong. That is the art of war. Now they're trying to appear very strong now, but it's only because they're weak. They know that their system that they have used to control everyone is about to collapse. The fiat Ponzi scheme is finally coming down. And that's why they're going for broke. That's why they're going all in now. Because they know that this has the potential to end their reign and to give power back to the people, particularly if people start to take control of real money. If they start to take control of real money and they don't allow it to be kept and hoarded by them. Now, of course, they'll still have all of their wealth and finances, but it will bring power back to the people. And that could change everything, particularly now you've got this other faction on the opposite side of the world that, whilst I know better in terms of their authoritarianism and their totalitarianism, at least they're bringing back a monetary system that may, because remember, we're talking about at least the global system, the global reserve, that will have integrity, but they also may bring back integrity to national currencies too. And in the very least, a multipolar world will be less, let's say, dramatic than the current one. It will be more secure. And from that, the people will have more space to hopefully start to build their parallel communities and systems without the constant threat of totalitarian states coming in and enacting a war or a pandemic or any of these other crises. So there's a lot of potential here. There's a lot of potential in the coming few years. And I think they're terrified that once this system comes down, they not only lose their international standing vis-a-vis these other countries, but they also have their populaces take back more of their freedoms and their God-given rights. That they realize and wake up to what's been done to them for thousands of years and say, wait a minute, isn't it strange? It's always the same people on top. And that in this new system that you're proposing, with the climate crisis and all of these other crises, it's going to be the same people on the top again. Only this time, they're going to have complete control of the food supply, complete control of your energy, complete control over what you can do, say, think. You know what I mean? So that's what they're going. That's why they're going for broke, because they're terrified that people are going to wake up, and lots of people are. But they're trying to appear very confident. So you've got to ask yourself, are you going to support them enacting this new system? Because if you give them what they want at that point, I guess what you're actually doing is supporting the creation of the new totalitarian system. You've basically given up your only escape route, and you've set a very bad example to other people. I think what we should be doing as citizens is the opposite. We should be doing what's right. And what's right is for you to survive, protect yourself, and then you can go on to make a better system, and you can help your community out. You can do the right things. If you're wiped out and everyone else is wiped out, that's the fast track to slavery. So if we're talking about this as a philosophical question and a moral question, I certainly personally think it would not be a moral thing to do, because we know what would happen. They would simply continue this reign of terror that we've lived through for thousands of years. And I think we need the opposite. We need people to go back to independent means of protecting their wealth, of using money. And that is only done through God's money, which is gold and silver. And silver's an interesting one too. A lot of people say, will they confiscate silver too? Well, after Executive Order 6102, after that one, there was another executive order the year after, which also confiscated silver bullion. So people often don't realize that silver bullion was confiscated too. And again, there was different workarounds for that too, some exemptions for jewelers and whatnot and artisans, but still, it was still a silver confiscation. Now, could they do that this time? Well, of course they could. They're talking literally about taking over the means of production. In fact, they're putting laws in Europe now to do this. So they can take over the whole food supply chain. They can take over people's farms. It doesn't matter. They're talking about having complete control. So make no mistake, they'll come for whatever they want to come for. And if they want to trap people in the system, they will try. And it's your job to actually not get trapped, to not allow them to do that. That's what gold and silver are. They are the rebellious assets. If at the final hurdle, you're going to give that back over to the state, well, you may regret that for the rest of your life. But it's up to the individual, of course. It's up to the individual what they do with their future. Now, to give you an example of a gold confiscation that failed, to give you some hope and inspiration, we only have to look back to the Gold Confiscation Act of 1968 in India. Now, like I said, India has a huge amount of gold in private hands. And this is how people protect their wealth from the state. This is how gold has always been. It's to protect us from the robbing, greedy, and corrupt state from stealing wealth. So if you have your mindset just as gold an investment to save money, but the moment the state tells me to give it to them, I'm going to do it, well, you've missed the point. You've missed the point there. Gold is the key protection, the financial protection. There's ways to protect yourself from the state. To protect yourself from state violence, people own guns. To protect yourself from theft of your money and wealth, people use gold. To protect yourself from having the state run roughshod over you, you build communities and have a political system and a legal system. These are protections, and you shouldn't give away your protections. Now, like I said, if we go back to India, to the Gold Confiscation Act of 1968, they confiscated the entire nation's bullion, whether it was a coin or a bar. They confiscated it all. They said you have to hand it over to the state. And what happened? Well, I'll tell you what happened. It failed. It failed miserably because the people refused. They said absolutely not. And all they did was start to melt down their bullion and create jewelry out of it because jewelry was exempt. Now, if you want to know why India has used gold and jewelry to protect their wealth for hundreds of years, that is why. They did have bullion for a time, but the moment the state started to say, well, we're going to confiscate it, they said, fair, well, we're just going to melt it down and create jewelry out of it. And that's exactly what they did. And the state failed. And they had to try again and again and again. They started to make gold bonds where they said, you give us the gold, we'll give you a bond with interest. And in 10 years, we'll give you back your gold and you'll have had all this interest. And the people said, no, thank you. We're going to keep the gold. And they tried repeatedly and it failed. And India had a massive problem because they created this act, they created this law, but nobody followed it. And what happened? Those citizens still have their wealth, they still have their gold, and it's passed on from generation to generation. So that is what can happen if the citizens just simply don't abide by it. They can't enforce it. It's impossible to do. And if they try to, then it could lead to a revolution. If they're going around and confiscating things from people's private houses, well, like I said, that's not something you want to do in countries where you've got lots of people. Now, one thing that you might see in the West is lots of propaganda. Lots and lots of propaganda about gold. You could start to see that in the coming years, particularly if we start to see this new monetary system. We have a fiat collapse. Everyone's desperate. Everyone has their pensions wiped out, can't afford their bills, can't afford food. And then all of a sudden the government starts to do this propaganda campaign saying, well, we need to start using our gold. We need more gold, but there's people hoarding it. These horrible people hoarding gold. And that word hoarding, that will come back. Maybe we see that. And maybe then there's a public outcry over people that own gold. That could happen too. People are very easily manipulated, as we have seen recently. So that's something to think about as well. There could be a propaganda campaign, but again, it would be up to the person to disclose if they had it or not and to hand it over. If they wanted to, they could. Otherwise, what would happen is the same thing that happened in India. There would be a huge black market. In India, apparently, it was the biggest black market in gold that has ever existed because nobody wanted to hand it over, so they just created a black market. There were separate prices. They were trading it, buying it, melting it down, remelting it down. All kinds of stuff was going on, and people continued to use gold, and all it essentially did was ensure that the state looked like it wasn't legitimate because it turned everyone into a rebel. I think the same thing's going to happen again when we have the next fiat Ponzi collapse. Once it happens over here, which could happen any day now, could happen this year. When that happens and they try to instigate some kind of totalitarian monetary system, whether it's CBDCs further down the line or there's some interim system, all it's going to do is create the biggest black market in human history. That's what's going to happen. And you've got to think critically during these moments in history and take responsibility for your own decisions, of course, but also understand there's going to be a whole lot of people out there that are also not going to participate in the tyranny. You have to starve the beast, as they say. And we talk about that financially by taking your money out of their system. Lots of people are doing that, either through precious metals or crypto or other stores of wealth. People are also starving them of their time and attention and money by not having subscriptions to Netflix and all these different companies, Disney. Get yourself out of that too. You've got to starve those systems, because if you starve it, then it will come down quicker and they won't be able to recover. The only thing that allows it to continue is by people putting their consciousness into it and their finances too. But if you take yourself out of that, then very quickly it'll fall apart. Get rid of your TV. That's another one. Don't allow them to have access to your psychology. That's another key one. So like I said, in India, it was very successful for the people, and eventually they had to repeal it. And today, India has the largest private gold holdings of any country. That's what I think you should be looking at. That's what I think people should be thinking about, is how are they going to manage the potential for a gold confiscation? Because it could happen. I think it's likely. It's the same way I think it's likely they're going to try and force everyone to take more drugs, and I think it's likely they're going to try and do a CBDC. But just because they try and do stuff, it doesn't mean it's going to be successful. It doesn't mean it's going to be successful. The success depends on you as an individual taking part in it. And you don't have to take part in it. Now, like I said, the word hoarding's interesting because I always think they tell us what they're going to do. I always think they give us signs and symbols, and they give us a tell to let us know what their plan is. And recently, I saw an article about the British CBDC, and I shared it with you in my recent video. If you haven't seen it, go back and watch that. And what they said in this article, the government said, and they used this specific word, they're going to stop people from hoarding the new CBDC. Now I thought, wow, I haven't heard that word for a long, long time. In fact, the last time I heard that was when it came to gold. The British government used it when they confiscated the gold. They talked about hoarding, and the American government did. So why did they bring out that word? And I did some research on it, and like I said, I found out it's a very specific legal term. So is this them giving us a tell? Because it certainly triggered in my consciousness, and I'm sure it did in other people who understand the gold history. It brought back in my consciousness the gold confiscation. So I just thought that was interesting. I do believe that they tell us what they're going to do. I do believe things like that do have significance. And let's imagine they actually create a gold-backed cryptocurrency. We already know that Russia's talking about doing this for international trade. Iran too, they're talking about a gold-backed crypto. Again, I've done videos on this. You can go back and check them out if you don't know about it. But let's imagine that the West does this too. Maybe the West is forced to do it. Now, do I think they'd do a redeemable gold-backed crypto? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. I think what would happen is they'd say, right, okay, we've had this financial collapse. Everyone's desperate. Everyone is now dependent on the state who didn't prepare. We're going to bring back a new type of CBDC, but it's going to be backed by something real. It's going to have integrity. I think they would try and do that, particularly in light of what the East is doing. They're going to have to try and replicate that, I think, because people are going to see what's happening over there and then realize what's being done to them, and they're going to be clamoring for something. They're not going to accept fiat anymore. So maybe at that point they do a gold-backed CBDC or a gold-backed crypto. However, I think they would keep the gold and they'd give people the CBDC, but it wouldn't be redeemable. And maybe that's why they're setting up now to make these cryptocurrencies something that have limitations on how much you can hold. And they're using this term hoarding. Maybe that's a part of it. Maybe they end up being backed by gold, and that's where it comes in, that you cannot hoard the CBDC. You can't hoard the CBDC, you can't hoard gold. We're taking back the gold to stop people hoarding it. Maybe they're going to link those two things up. Again, just speculating. We don't know. These are just ideas that come to me when I hear these things and see what's happening. We actually don't know what's going to happen. And that's the interesting thing. It could go many different ways. Where does this leave us all? Are we going to see a gold confiscation in the coming years? What's my personal opinion? Well, like I said, I think it's absolutely possible. And I think the most vulnerable places are the ones that I mentioned. It's the ones with the highest debt and also the ones that have probably the most to lose. And that would be the US, Great Britain, Australia perhaps too, although Australia is a kind of in-betweener because although it's going to be totalitarian over there, it is very closely aligned with China, despite what they say. That could go either way. Canada, maybe they just nationalize the mines over there because they're forced to by the US. That could happen, and I think we're going to see a lot of mine nationalizations down in the South. So all of these Western corporations that have mines in the global South, Latin America, we're going to see wave after wave of nationalization too. That's a confiscation. It's a different type of confiscation because it's their own gold. So like I said, it's a nationalization. It would be awful losses for the West. That's probably going to happen too. And in the West, yeah, like I said, there are ways to do it. I think it'd be similar to the you-know-what. I think it would be all about fear and propaganda, threat, manipulation, psychological operations. I think that's what it would look like. And ultimately, the person would have to volunteer. But some people would, some people wouldn't. It'd all be about your own perspective. And like I said, there is a philosophical and moral element to this that you really would need to think through. Do you want to help their new system come into being? Do you want to support them with that? Or do you want to empower yourself as an individual and live in the side of truth? Remember, gold is God's metal. It represents God. It represents the Son of God. And I think that is something to think deeply about in the coming years when we're facing what I would class as evil. I think there's something to think about. There's something there. And if you reflect on it for long enough, you start to see that maybe that is the path to go down, rather than allow them to drag you across to their side and help them in their whatever it is they're planning to do, which, as we all know, doesn't look very good. So that's it for today's show, everyone. I hope you found this one useful. Like I said, gold confiscation is something to take seriously, although you have to think about it in light of everything that I've said in today's episode, and then you have to make your own decision as an individual. Do you want to go down with the ship? Do you want to hand over your gold only to see it revalued at a higher price? These are decisions for you as an individual to make. But hopefully today's episode has helped you think about this and given you some more food for thought. Like I said earlier, if you would like to learn more about this, if you'd like to better protect yourself from a gold confiscation, please check out my Patreon. I'm going to be putting an article on there specifically in relation to this topic called 5 Ways to Protect Yourself from Gold Confiscation. And I think you're going to find that really useful. It's going to have some really good tips for helping ensuring that you do not succumb to a gold confiscation by accident or by force in the future. Also, you'll be able to join my Telegram group and my community over there, and you'll be able to access some other content relating to finance. Similarly, you can also join my YouTube channel and become a member there. That is how this video was made. It was decided upon by my YouTube channel members, and I'll be doing polls like this in the future, and also some future live streams for members only. And the reason I'm going to do that is just as something additional for people who help support the channel and help support my work. It really does help me to have that. So like I said, I hope you enjoyed this video. Have a fantastic weekend, and I will see you in the next one.